My father always believed that character revealed itself when money entered the room. As a teenager, I dismissed those words as another lesson from a man who had built a manufacturing company from an empty warehouse and 20 years of relentless work. I thought loyalty between brothers was stronger than any temptation. I was wrong. My younger brother, Daniel, had spent years charming everyone who crossed his path. He remembered birthdays, volunteered for family gatherings, and always knew exactly what to say to make relatives laugh. I was quieter, happier managing operations at our father's company than standing in front of people. When Dad became ill, I handled suppliers, employees, and payroll, while Daniel suddenly became the devoted son, escorting him to appointments, organizing paperwork, and making sure every visitor saw him sitting faithfully beside the hospital bed. Looking back, I realized he wasn't caring for our father. He was studying him. The funeral drew nearly 500 people, and every speech praised my father's honesty. Daniel cried so convincingly that distant relatives hugged him for hours while I stood exhausted after arranging every detail of the service. 3 days later, our attorney invited us to the office for the reading of the estate. I expected a straightforward division. Dad had often said the business would be shared equally because we had both contributed in different ways. Instead, the lawyer cleared his throat and announced that a revised trust, signed only 4 months before Dad's death, transferred nearly everything to Daniel. The company, the lake house, the investment accounts, even Dad's classic car collection. I was left with an aging pickup truck and a modest savings account that barely covered 6 months of living expenses. My hands turned cold as I stared at the documents. Dad had never mentioned changing anything. I asked the attorney if there had been some mistake. He simply pointed toward notarized signatures and witnesses. Everything appeared perfectly legal. Daniel leaned back in his chair, wearing an expression carefully balanced between sympathy and satisfaction. Dad believed I was better prepared to protect what he built, he said softly. He didn't think you had the vision to grow it. Those words struck harder than the inheritance itself because they sounded nothing like my father. I challenged the documents, but every page looked authentic. The signatures matched. The dates aligned. The witnesses confirmed their presence. I walked out, believing grief had clouded my judgment until I remembered one detail. For months earlier, Dad had been recovering from heavy medication following surgery. He struggled to sign birthday cards without assistance. Yet somehow he had executed dozens of complex legal documents. That memory refused to leave me. I hired an attorney specializing in estate litigation. After reviewing everything, she delivered the answer I feared. Suspicious isn't enough, she explained. You need evidence, not instincts. Evidence cost money, and money was the one thing I no longer had. Within weeks, Daniel dismissed me from the company, claiming restructuring was necessary. Employees who had worked beside me for 15 years avoided eye contact as security escorted me from the building. I packed family photographs and a coffee mug from my desk into a cardboard box while Daniel watched from the executive office that had once belonged to our father. The next month, he hosted a lavish celebration at the lake house, calling it a new beginning for the company. Nearly everyone accepted the invitation. Through social media, I watched videos of expensive champagne flowing, fireworks exploding above the water, and guests applauding Daniel's speech. Then someone uploaded the moment that changed everything. Raising a crystal glass, Daniel laughed loudly enough for every camera to capture it. Here's to fresh starts, he declared. And here's to finally proving that hard work beats dead weight every single time. The crowd laughed. Someone turned the camera toward me because I had unexpectedly arrived to collect a few personal items Dad had stored in the boathouse. Daniel looked directly at me, lifted his glass even higher, and smiled with unmistakable satisfaction. Some people spend their lives waiting for success to be handed to them, he said. Tonight we celebrate the people who actually earned it. More laughter followed. I quietly picked up my father's old toolbox, returned to my truck, and drove away without saying a single word. That night my attorney called to ask whether I intended to continue fighting despite the odds. I looked again at the video of Daniel's toast, paused on the arrogant smile frozen across his face, and made a decision that surprised even me. No, yen suarat calmly. Not now. She sounded confused until I added 6 words that would define the next year of my life. I'll reply exactly 1 year later. Then I hung up, opened a blank notebook, wrote today's date across the first page, and beneath it, I added a single sentence that became my only promise. Every day from this moment forward will become part of his bill. For the first month, everyone assumed I had accepted defeat. Friends stopped calling because they believed I was embarrassed. Former coworkers avoided mentioning the company. Relatives whispered that Daniel had always been the smarter brother and that our father must have seen something I hadn't. I let every rumor spread without correction. Silence became my greatest disguise. While Daniel enjoyed interviews in local business magazines and posted photographs of expensive vacations, I rented a small apartment above an old hardware store and accepted consulting jobs that barely cover my expenses. To anyone watching, I looked like a man rebuilding from nothing. In reality, I was rebuilding something far more valuable than wealth. I was assembling the truth. Every evening, I reviewed documents from my years at the company. I had personally digitized thousands of invoices, contracts, maintenance records, and internal emails long before cloud storage became standard. Most people considered those archives worthless because they focused on operations rather than ownership. But operations reveal habits, and habits expose lies. I noticed something unusual. During the exact month Dad supposedly revised his trust, Daniel had repeatedly instructed the accounting department to pay an unfamiliar consulting firm unusually large fees. The firm's name appeared nowhere before or after those transactions. My curiosity turned into suspicion when I discovered its mailing address belonged to a small office building that had been vacant for nearly 2 years. Someone had created a company that barely existed. My attorney agreed the discovery was interesting, but warned that fake consulting firms alone wouldn't overturn an inheritance. You still need to connect every piece, she reminded me. That connection arrived unexpectedly through someone I hadn't spoken to since the funeral. Margaret, my father's executive assistant for nearly 20 years, asked if we could meet privately. She looked nervous as she slid an envelope across the table. Inside were photocopies of appointment schedules from Dad's final months. One date had been circled in red. According to the revised trust, Dad signed every inheritance document that afternoon. According to Margaret's schedule, he had never left the rehabilitation clinic because he was receiving intensive therapy after complications for surgery. I always thought something felt wrong, she whispered. But Daniel told everyone the meeting happened after visiting hours. She paused before adding the sentence that made my pulse quicken. Except your father couldn't even hold a pen that week. It was the first crack in Daniel's perfect story, but cracks alone don't collapse buildings. I needed proof that could survive a courtroom. Over the following months, I quietly tracked the mysterious consulting company. Public filings revealed it had been registered by another corporation. That corporation led to a third. Eventually, the trail reached a financial advisor who had abruptly retired 6 weeks after Dad's death and moved overseas. The timing was impossible to ignore. My attorney hired a forensic accountant who specialized in tracing hidden transactions. 3 months later, he placed a thick report on the conference table. Daniel had secretly transferred hundreds of thousands of dollars from company reserve accounts into shell businesses long before Dad died. Those funds paid for legal services, document preparation, private investigators, and unexplained cash withdrawals. Someone had invested enormous resources before the inheritance was changed, as though planning every step well in advance. Then another surprise arrived. A former notary contacted my attorney after seeing a public notice related to the estate. She admitted her official seal had been reported stolen nearly a year earlier. The seal appearing on Dad's revised trust matched the stolen one perfectly. She insisted she had never witnessed my father's signature. For the first time, my attorney smiled instead of cautioning patience. Now, she said quietly, we're no longer asking questions. We're proving fraud. Still, I refused to file immediately. My attorney thought I had lost perspective until I reminded her of the promise I'd made after Daniel's toast. Exactly 1 year. Not a day earlier. Meanwhile, Daniel's confidence grew into recklessness. He expanded the company too aggressively, borrowing millions against its assets to finance luxury developments and risky acquisitions. Newspapers praised him as an ambitious visionary. Investors applauded quarterly growth without realizing much of it existed only on carefully manipulated reports. Former employees who had once respected him privately began reaching out to me. They described accounting irregularities, missing inventory, inflated valuations, and intense pressure to alter financial statements before audits. I documented every conversation without revealing what I already knew. One employee secretly copied emails showing Daniel ordering staff to destroy older financial records before outside auditors arrived. Another recorded a meeting in which Daniel laughed that paper trails only matter if someone lives long enough to follow them. By the 10th month, my attorney's office contained shelves filled with evidence. Forged signatures, fraudulent financial transfers, witness statements, expert handwriting analysis. Digital metadata proving several estate documents had been created on a computer that belonged not to my father, but to Daniel's personal assistant. Every piece reinforced the next until the case resembled an iron chain instead of scattered accusations. My attorney asked again why I insisted on waiting. I opened my notebook to the first page, where only one sentence had been written a year earlier. Then I turned to the final blank page and wrote the date exactly 3 weeks away. Because he raised a glass to celebrate my destruction, I said. On the anniversary of that toast, every person he impressed with that speech will watch him answer for it. I don't want revenge in private. I want the truth served in front of the same audience that applauded the lie. 3 days later, an elegant invitation arrived in my mailbox. Daniel was hosting another anniversary celebration at the lake house, boasting about the company's most profitable year in history. The event would begin at 7 o'clock. I smiled for the first time since our father's funeral, because at exactly 7:15, while Daniel prepared to offer another triumphant toast, a federal marshal, 2 financial crime investigators, and my attorney would be walking through the front gate carrying documents that would ensure no one ever applauded him again. At exactly 7 o'clock the following Friday, the lake house looked almost identical to the celebration I had watched online a year earlier. Luxury cars filled the driveway, a live jazz band played beside the dock, and waiters carried silver trays of champagne through a crowd of investors, executives, politicians, and relatives. Daniel stood on the same stone terrace where he had mocked me 12 months before, wearing the same confident smile that had convinced everyone he deserved everything our father left behind. I arrived alone, dressed in a simple navy suit, attracting the same curious glances I had received the previous year. Daniel noticed me immediately and laughed loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I was wondering if you'd finally come to congratulate me," he said. "Took you long enough." I answered with nothing more than a polite nod and checked my watch. 7:12. He mistook my calmness for surrender. At 7:15, he lifted a crystal glass and tapped it gently with a silver spoon until the crowd fell silent. 1 year ago, he announced, we celebrated a new chapter. Since then, we've doubled revenue, expanded into 3 states, and proven that bold leadership always wins. Applause erupted. Then he looked directly at me. "Some people spend their lives waiting for opportunities," he continued with a grin. "Others create them. I like to thank everyone who believed in me instead of believing excuses." More applause. Several guests laughed. Daniel raised his glass higher, preparing to drink, but before it reached his lips, the front gate opened. Every conversation stopped. 2 federal marshals entered alongside financial crime investigators, followed by my attorney carrying 2 thick binders and a uniformed deputy from the probate court. They walked with deliberate confidence across the terrace until they stood directly beside Daniel. One marshal unfolded an official document and spoke clearly enough for every guest to hear. "Daniel Mercer, you are hereby served with civil and criminal complaints relating to fraud, forgery, financial misconduct, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy connected to the estate of Jonathan Mercer and Mercer Industrial Holdings." The champagne glass slipped from Daniel's hand and shattered across the stone floor. Silence replaced the music. He stared at the documents as though they belonged to someone else. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "My lawyers will bury this." My attorney calmly opened the first binder. "Perhaps," she replied, "but they'll need to explain forged notarizations, falsified trust documents, shell corporations, diverted company funds, fabricated consulting invoices, altered accounting records, deleted emails recovered from backup servers, handwriting analysis, witness testimony, banking records, and digital metadata showing your assistant drafted the revised trust before your father supposedly approved it." She closed the binder with a soft thud. "That's only volume 1. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Investors stepped away from Daniel, as those standing beside him had become dangerous. His chief financial officer slowly removed the company identification badge from his jacket and placed it on a nearby table before walking away without saying a word. Margaret approached from the crowd, looked Daniel directly in the eyes, and quietly stated, "Your father never signed those papers." Then she joined me without another glance toward him. The lead investigator addressed several executives individually, informing them that company records had been frozen pending forensic review. One investor immediately called his attorney. Another demanded explanations Daniel could no longer provide. Phones appeared everywhere as guests recorded every second of the collapse. The same people who had applauded his speech moments earlier now whispered about prison sentences and financial fraud. Daniel tried to regain control. He pointed at me with a trembling hand. "He planned this," he shouted. "He's trying to destroy everything Dad built." I finally spoke for the first time all evening. "No. Unforgettable. You began destroying it the day you decided stealing was easier than earning." I removed my phone from my pocket and played the video from exactly 1 year earlier. His own voice echoed across the silent terrace. "Tonight we celebrate the people who actually earned it." When the recording ended, I locked eyes with him. "You were right," I said. "Tonight we do." The investigators escorted him toward the waiting vehicles while reporters, alerted earlier through public court filings, arrived outside the property. By sunrise, every local news outlet carried the story. Within days, the board suspended Daniel permanently. Lenders demanded immediate repayment of outstanding loans. Regulators launched independent investigations, and shareholders filed lawsuits seeking damages. The probate court invalidated the fraudulent trust after overwhelming evidence established it had been forged. My father's original estate plan was restored exactly as he had intended years earlier. Ownership of the company returned equally, but after consulting with employees and advisors, I purchased Daniel's forfeited interest through the court-supervised process once creditors completed their claims. For the first time, the business belonged to someone committed to protecting it rather than exploiting it. Months later, I stood inside my father's old office overlooking the factory floor. The machines still hummed with the same steady rhythm they had when he was alive. Margaret handed me a small envelope she had discovered while organizing archive files. Inside was a handwritten note from my father, dated years before his illness. It read, "If you're reading this after I'm gone, remember that money measures success for only a moment. Character measures it forever. The wrong person can inherit wealth. They can never inherit integrity." I folded the note carefully and placed it in my wallet. Reporters later asked whether waiting an entire year had been worth it. I answered with complete honesty. Revenge wasn't the point. Timing was. If I had reacted with anger, people would have seen a bitter brother. By waiting, gathering evidence, and letting the truth mature, they witnessed exactly what my father always believed. Lies can win an inheritance overnight, but they cannot survive a year under the weight of the truth. As I left the courthouse after the final hearing, I passed the same video screen where news channels replayed Daniel's champagne toast beside footage of him being escorted away in handcuffs. One clip captured his celebration. The other captured his downfall. Nothing could have illustrated my father's lesson more perfectly. Some victories arrive quickly and disappear just as fast. The lasting ones are earned patiently, one deliberate day at a time.